I stepped outside my house, only to find my car completely gone. There, standing with a smug smile plastered across her face, was Karen, our HOA president, clutching a violation notice in her manicured hand. "I had your car towed for violating HOA parking regulations," she announced triumphantly, her voice dripping with satisfaction. "Maybe next time you'll follow our rules?" What Karen didn't know, what she couldn't possibly have realized, was that this wasn't just any ordinary vehicle. It was an unmarked police car. How could I possibly let this slide? What would happen when Karen finally realized the catastrophic mistake she had just made? Would she apologize profusely or double down on her power trip? But the actions I took next, they didn't just teach Karen a lesson, they brought the entire HOA board crashing down in a way that nobody in our quiet suburban neighborhood could have ever imagined. Let me introduce myself. I'm Detective James Miller, though I prefer to keep that information private from my neighbors. After 15 years working undercover narcotics in downtown Chicago, I desperately needed a change of pace. 6 months ago, I transferred to a quieter precinct and moved into Oakwood Estates, a peaceful suburban neighborhood with manicured lawns and picket fences, the kind of place where people actually wave to each other in the morning. My unmarked police cruiser, a nondescript black Dodge Charger, became my daily driver. Nothing flashy, just practical. No sirens visible, no police markings, but equipped with everything I needed for my work. I typically parked it in front of my house, as my garage was still filled with unpacked boxes. Little did I know this simple parking choice would trigger a suburban nightmare. Enter Karen Thompson, the self-appointed dictator of Oakwood Estates. As HOA president for the past 8 years, Karen ruled our neighborhood with an iron fist and a binder full of regulations. In her mid-50s, with a perfectly maintained blonde bob and perpetually pursed lips, Karen approached every minor infraction as if it were a federal offense. The HOA exists to maintain property values, she would declare at every monthly meeting, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "And I will not allow anyone to jeopardize what we've built here." Karen's reign of terror included a laundry list of increasingly absurd regulations. No vehicles could be parked on the street for more than 2 hours, a rule she selectively enforced. Houses could only be painted in 12 pre-approved colors, all variations of beige and gray. Outdoor gatherings had to disperse by 8 p.m. sharp, regardless of the occasion. Even holiday decorations were strictly regulated, put up no earlier than 2 weeks before the holiday, taken down no later than 2 days after. My first encounter with Karen occurred just 3 days after moving in. I was unloading groceries when she materialized beside my car, clipboard in hand. "Excuse me," she said, not sounding excused at all. "Are you aware that your vehicle exceeds our community standards for acceptable automobiles?" I blinked, confused. "It's just a standard Dodge Charger. It's black," she replied, as if that explained everything. Dark-colored vehicles make our neighborhood look unwelcoming. That was just the beginning. Over the next few months, I received 6 written warnings about my parking habits. Each notice became increasingly threatening, with highlighted sections of the HOA bylaws and passive-aggressive notes scrawled in the margins. I tried explaining that as a law enforcement officer, I needed my vehicle readily accessible, but Karen wasn't interested in exceptions. "If you wanted special treatment," she sniffed during our last confrontation, "you should have moved somewhere else." Rules are rules. The situation reached its breaking point last Tuesday. After returning from a grueling 14-hour shift investigating a trafficking ring, I was too exhausted to argue about where I parked. I left my car in its usual spot and collapsed into bed, planning to deal with Karen's inevitable complaints in the morning. Instead, I woke up to find my car gone along with the case files, my service weapon secured in the lockbox, and specialized equipment worth thousands of dollars. Standing on my empty driveway in my bathrobe, I felt a mixture of disbelief and rage building inside me. That's when I spotted Karen marching across the street, waving a pink paper triumphantly. "I warned you repeatedly," she announced, loud enough for the entire neighborhood to hear. "Now you'll learn that the HOA means business. Your car has been towed to impound, and you'll need to pay a $350 fine plus towing fees to get it back." I took a deep breath, years of police training helping me maintain my composure. "Karen, do you understand what you've just done?" "Enforce the rules," she replied smugly. "In this neighborhood, the HOA is the law." That's when I knew Karen Thompson had finally gone too far. This wasn't just about a parking space anymore. This was obstruction of justice, interference with police equipment, and potentially compromising an active investigation. As I walked back into my house to make some calls, one thing became crystal clear. Karen's reign of terror was about to come to an abrupt and spectacular end. The morning after my car was towed, I found an envelope taped to my front door. Inside was an official-looking invoice from Oakwood Estates HOA, printed on premium paper with the association's gold-embossed letterhead. The amount due, $750, $350 for the willful violation of Parking Ordinance 27.3, $250 for towing fees, and an additional $150 labeled simply as administrative processing. At the bottom, in Karen's unmistakable handwriting, payment due within 48 hours or additional penalties will apply. No exceptions. I took a deep breath and folded the paper carefully. As a detective, I'd learned to control my emotions even in the most infuriating situations. This skill had never been more necessary than now. After calling my precinct to explain the situation and arrange temporary transportation, I decided to attempt a reasonable conversation with Karen. Perhaps she simply didn't understand the severity of her actions. I walked the 3 houses down to her immaculately maintained colonial with its perfectly symmetrical shrubs and color-coordinated flower beds. I rang the doorbell exactly once. Multiple rings were prohibited under HOA noise regulations. Ironically enough, Karen opened the door wearing gardening gloves and a wide-brimmed hat, despite there being no evidence she'd been gardening. "Oh," she said, her lips tightening. "I assume you're here about the fine. The drop box for payments is at the community center." "Karen," I began, keeping my voice measured and professional, "we need to discuss what happened. That vehicle you had towed is actually an unmarked police car. I'm a detective with the county police department and—" "Stop right there," she interrupted, holding up one gloved hand. "Do you really expect me to believe that? If you were actually police, you'd have proper identification on your vehicle." "That's the point of an unmarked car," I explained patiently. "I'm working on sensitive cases that require discretion." Karen's eyes narrowed suspiciously. "Even if that were true, which I highly doubt, it doesn't exempt you from our community guidelines. Rules exist for everyone, regardless of occupation. In Oakwood Estates, I am the authority you need to respect." "Karen, this isn't about rules anymore. You had official police property impounded. There were case files and equipment in that vehicle. This could constitute obstruction of justice." Her face flushed red, but she doubled down. "Threats won't work on me. If anything, this hostile attitude proves you're exactly the kind of resident we don't want here. Perhaps you should consider moving somewhere more appropriate for your lifestyle." Before I could respond, she closed the door firmly in my face. By that afternoon, the neighborhood was buzzing with gossip. My next-door neighbor, Mike Sanchez, stopped by with a six-pack of beer and an apologetic expression. "Heard about your car, man," he said, handing me a cold bottle. "Karen's gone too far this time. She's been terrorizing this neighborhood for years." Mike wasn't alone. Throughout the day, several neighbors visited to express their support. Elderly Miss S. Chen brought homemade dumplings and stories about how Karen had fined her for hanging traditional Chinese lanterns during Lunar New Year. The Patels shared how they'd been cited for excessive cooking aromas when preparing food for their daughter's wedding. "We've all wanted to stand up to her," explained Rebecca Johnson, a kindergarten teacher who lived across the street, "but she's vindictive. Cross Karen once, and suddenly you're getting violation notices for grass that's half an inch too tall." However, not everyone was sympathetic. Later that evening, I noticed a group of neighbors gathered on Karen's porch, her loyal inner circle. Among them was Walter Green, the HOA treasurer, who glared at me while I collected my mail. The next morning, I found my newspaper soaking in a puddle despite the clear sky, and someone had anonymously reported my garbage bins for being improperly aligned with the curb. The situation escalated 3 days later when I returned from work to find a police cruiser parked outside my house. Officer Ramirez, a rookie I recognized from the precinct, looked embarrassed as he approached me. "Detective Miller," he said quietly, "we received a complaint about a resident impersonating a police officer." The caller was quite insistent. I couldn't help but laugh. "Let me guess, Karen Thompson?" Ramirez nodded uncomfortably. She provided a detailed statement claiming you're pretending to be law enforcement to intimidate the neighborhood association. After clearing up the misunderstanding and showing Ramirez my badge, I watched him drive away, knowing Karen was certainly watching from behind her pristine curtains. That evening, I decided it was time for a strategic approach. I spread my dining table with every HOA document I could find: bylaws, covenants, meeting minutes from the past 5 years, and state regulations governing homeowners associations. If Karen wanted to play by the rules, I would make sure we were using the complete rulebook. 4 hours and 2 pots of coffee later, I found what I was looking for. According to state law, HOA towing policies required 1. A minimum 24-hour written notice before towing, 2. Photographic evidence of the violation, 3. Approval from at least 2 board members, and 4. Towing only by licensed operators, contracted specifically by the HOA. Karen had followed none of these requirements. The towing company she'd used, Quick and Clean Towing, wasn't even licensed for private property removals, according to the state database I accessed. More importantly, I discovered that Karen had never been properly re-elected. The HOA bylaws required elections every 2 years with a minimum 60% participation rate. The meeting minutes revealed that the last 3 elections had barely reached 30% attendance mostly. Karen's friends and no formal ballots had been cast. For years, Karen had been ruling through intimidation rather than legitimate authority. As dawn broke, I organized my findings into a comprehensive file. This wasn't just about getting my car back anymore. This was about ending a petty dictatorship that had been making everyone's lives miserable. I was interrupted by the shrill ring of my phone. The caller ID showed it was the precinct. "Detective Miller," said Captain Rodriguez, his voice unusually tense. "We have a situation. The evidence from the Wilson trafficking case, the files that were in your vehicle, they're missing from the impound lot." My blood ran cold. Those files contained witness names, addresses, and operational details for an ongoing investigation into one of the largest drug trafficking operations in the state. And there's something else, the captain continued. The towing company claims they received the call from someone claiming to be from our department. They specifically asked for your vehicle to be moved to a secondary location before processing. The realization hit me like a freight train. This wasn't just about Karen's power trip anymore. Either through stunning incompetence or something more sinister, she had inadvertently interfered with a major criminal investigation and potentially put lives at risk. "I'll be right there," I said, grabbing my keys. Karen Thompson had no idea what she'd just unleashed. The precinct buzzed with activity when I arrived. Captain Rodriguez had assembled a task force to locate the missing evidence, and the atmosphere was tense. Officers who normally greeted me with casual nods now approached with concerned expressions and offers of assistance. Word had spread quickly about the civilian who had managed to disrupt a major police operation through sheer bureaucratic pettiness. "Miller," Captain Rodriguez called from his office doorway. "In here now." I followed him into the glass-walled room where 3 other detectives and the department's legal counsel waited. The captain didn't waste time on pleasantries. "This is beyond a neighborhood dispute," he said, his voice low and controlled but vibrating with anger. "Interference with police equipment, obstruction of justice, potential compromise of a confidential investigation. We're talking serious charges here." Detective Sanchez, my partner on the trafficking case, slammed his fist on the table. 3 months of undercover work, informants who trusted us with their lives, all potentially exposed because some power-hungry HOA president couldn't tolerate a car parked on a public street. The department's attorney, Gloria Mendez, adjusted her glasses. "We need to move carefully here. This isn't just about recovering evidence. It's about establishing a clear precedent that civilian administrative bodies cannot interfere with law enforcement operations." "I've already started building a case," I said, opening my folder of meticulously organized documents. "Karen Thompson has been operating outside her legal authority for years. The HOA bylaws have been systematically violated, and there's a pattern of selective enforcement and personal vendettas." For the next 2 hours, we developed a comprehensive strategy. The department would handle the criminal aspects, the missing evidence, and obstruction charges, while I would pursue civil action against both Karen personally and the HOA as an entity. By the time we finished, it was nearly midnight, but I felt energized by a sense of purpose that went beyond personal vindication. The following morning, I contacted every neighbor who had ever mentioned problems with Karen. The response was overwhelming. Within hours, my living room transformed into an impromptu command center as residents arrived with documentation of HOA abuses, everything from arbitrary fines to threatened liens, all bearing Karen's signature and increasingly creative interpretations of community guidelines. Rebecca Johnson, the kindergarten teacher, brought 6 months of correspondence regarding her unapproved bird feeder. "She sent someone to measure the height every week," Rebecca explained, showing me photos with red circles indicating supposed violations down to the 1/4 inch. The Patels provided recordings of HOA meetings, where Karen had cut off their objections to new cultural celebration restrictions. Miss S. Chen revealed that her traditional lanterns had actually been confiscated from her property, technically theft. According to our attorney, by day's end, we had statements from 27 households, representing over 60% of Oakwood estates. More importantly, we had uncovered a pattern of financial discrepancies in the HOA accounting that Walter Green, the treasurer, had helped conceal. 3 days later, Karen Thompson received official notice of both criminal and civil proceedings against her. I wasn't present for her reaction, But according to Mike Sanchez, who happened to be checking his mail when the courier arrived, her face transitioned through several shades of red before settling on a ghostly white. That evening, my doorbell rang. Through the peephole, I could see Karen standing on my porch, clutching her designer handbag like a shield. Her normally perfect hair looked slightly disheveled, and her expression lacked its usual confidence. I opened the door but remained in the doorway, blocking entry. "Detective Miller," she began, her voice unnaturally high. "I believe there's been a terrible misunderstanding. Had I known you were actually police, I never would have." "You never would have what, Karen?" "Abused your authority? Interfered with a police investigation? Endangered the lives of witnesses and undercover officers?" She flinched at each question. "I was simply enforcing community standards that everyone agreed to when purchasing property here. But I'm willing to waive the fines and fees as a gesture of goodwill. Perhaps we could resolve this." "Neighborly dispute without involving the authorities?" I couldn't help but laugh. "I am the authorities, Karen. And this stopped being a neighborly dispute when you had my unmarked police vehicle towed with sensitive case files inside." "I've already spoken with Walter," she continued desperately. "We're prepared to offer you a position on the HOA board. You could help us improve our policies." "It's too late for that," I replied, my voice firm but calm. "The department has recovered most of the evidence, thankfully, but actions have consequences. I'll see you in court." The civil hearing was scheduled first, 2 weeks later, at the county courthouse. The courtroom was packed. Nearly every Oakwood Estates resident had shown up, along with local media who had caught wind of the story. Karen sat stiffly beside her attorney, a young man who looked increasingly uncomfortable as our evidence mounted. When it was my turn to testify, I approached the stand with the confidence of someone who had testified in hundreds of criminal proceedings. The judge, an older woman with shrewd eyes and little patience for nonsense, leaned forward as I began presenting our case. "Your Honor, this isn't simply about a towed vehicle or excessive fines," I explained, my voice clear and measured. "This is about a systematic abuse of power that has affected dozens of families. Miss Thompson has operated without proper authority for years, using intimidation and selective enforcement to maintain control. I detailed the improper elections, the financial irregularities, and the pattern of targeted harassment against residents who questioned her authority. Then came the most damning evidence. On April 15th, Miss Thompson arranged for the towing of what she knew to be my personal vehicle. What she didn't know, or chose to ignore despite my attempts to inform her, was that this was an unmarked police vehicle containing evidence critical to an ongoing trafficking investigation. The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Karen's attorney whispered urgently in her ear, but she brushed him off, her face a mask of indignation. "Furthermore," I continued, "the towing company Miss Thompson used was not legally authorized to remove vehicles from private property, and the secondary location where my car was initially taken matches an address connected to suspects in our investigation." The judge's eyebrows shot up. "Are you suggesting Miss Thompson was deliberately interfering with a police investigation, Detective Miller?" "I'm not suggesting criminal conspiracy, Your Honor, but I am stating unequivocally that her actions, whether born of malice or mere arrogance, directly impeded law enforcement operations and potentially endangered lives." Karen finally broke her silence, standing abruptly. "This is ridiculous! I was protecting our community, the property values, our way of life." The judge gavelled for order. "Miss Thompson, you will have your opportunity to speak. For now, I suggest you listen carefully to the serious allegations against you." By the time all testimony concluded, Karen's defense had crumbled entirely. The judge's ruling was swift and comprehensive. Karen was personally liable for all damages. The current HOA board was dissolved effective immediately, and a court-appointed administrator would oversee new elections with mandatory oversight for the next 5 years. As we filed out of the courtroom, Karen stood alone, her supporters having quickly disappeared when the financial improprieties came to light. She looked smaller somehow, her carefully constructed authority stripped away. "Detective," she called as I passed. "You've destroyed everything I built." I paused, considering her words. "No, Karen, you did that yourself. The difference between authority and power is legitimacy, and you never had that." The criminal charges were still pending, but as I walked into the sunshine where my neighbors waited with smiles and handshakes, I knew that Oakwood Estates had already begun its recovery from Karen's reign of terror. The criminal proceedings against Karen moved swiftly through the justice system. The district attorney, eager to demonstrate that interference with police operations would not be tolerated, pushed for maximum penalties. When the judge announced the sentence 6 months of house arrest, a $25,000 fine, and 2 years of probation, Karen's perfectly composed facade finally shattered completely. "This is outrageous," she shrieked, her voice echoing through the courtroom. "I was protecting property values. I was maintaining standards." The judge, unmoved by her outburst, simply adjusted his glasses. "Miss Thompson, your standards obstructed justice and potentially endangered lives. Consider yourself fortunate that no one was harmed as a result of your actions." News of Karen's downfall spread through Oakwood Estates like wildfire. Neighbors who had once cowered at the sight of her now openly discussed her misdeeds at community gatherings. The story even made the local news, with one outlet dubbing it HOA Gone Wild, when community power corrupts. Walter Green, the treasurer who had enabled Karen's financial improprieties, quietly put his house on the market and disappeared before charges could be filed against him. The transformation of our neighborhood was remarkable. Under the court-appointed administrator, the first truly democratic HOA election in years took place in the community center. The turnout was unprecedented. Nearly 90% of homeowners participated, eager to reclaim their community. Rebecca Johnson, the kindergarten teacher, was elected as the new president. Her first official act was to host a community restoration meeting where residents could propose changes to the oppressive rules Karen had implemented. Miss S. Chen proudly hung her traditional lanterns. The Patels hosted a spectacular Diwali celebration that the entire neighborhood attended, and children's laughter, once deemed excessive noise under Karen's regime, filled the streets again. One sunny Saturday morning, as I helped Mike Sanchez install a basketball hoop in his driveway previously forbidden under Karen's no recreational equipment visible from the street policy, a moving truck pulled up to Karen's colonial. We paused our work, watching as movers efficiently emptied the house of its contents. Karen emerged last, surveying her former domain with thinly veiled contempt. Her gaze eventually found mine across the street. For a moment we locked eyes, her expression hardening into something dangerous and unresolved. The electronic monitoring bracelet on her ankle caught the sunlight as she took a deliberate step in my direction. "Detective," she called, her voice carrying across the quiet street. "Enjoy your victory while it lasts. Some people never forget when they've been wrong." I set down my drill and walked calmly toward her, stopping at a respectful distance. Neighbors had begun to emerge from their homes, watching the exchange with undisguised interest. "Karen," I replied evenly, "that sounds remarkably like a threat." Her smile was cold and calculated. "Merely an observation. Life has a way of coming full circle. I certainly hope so, I answered. Justice usually does. As she turned to leave, her perfectly manicured hand gripped her car door with white knuckles. This isn't over, she whispered, just loud enough for me to hear. I watched her sleek sedan pull away from Oakwood Estates, perhaps for the last time. The neighbors gathered around, offering congratulations and relief that the Karen era had finally ended. But I couldn't shake the feeling that she meant what she said. When Rebecca asked if I thought Karen would actually return someday, I simply smiled and replied, "If she does, we'll be ready." Do you think Karen got what she deserved, or was justice too harsh? We'd love to hear your thoughts. Have you ever encountered an unreasonable HOA president, or a Karen who made your neighborhood life a living nightmare? Share your own battle stories in the comments below. Your experiences matter, and they might help others facing similar situations. Was there a particular moment in this saga that resonated with you? Perhaps you've developed your own strategies for dealing with power-hungry community leaders. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss our next captivating neighborhood drama. Who knows? Your story might inspire our next viral video series. Remember, standing up against injustice starts in our own communities. One voice can make a difference, just like our detective protagonist proved. Drop a like if you enjoyed this series, and let us know what kind of neighborhood conflicts you want to see covered next.